Imagine a sprawling warehouse on the outskirts of Billund, Denmark. It is a cavernous, silent space filled with the scent of stagnant air and old cardboard. On the floor, nestled in the thick grey dust of neglect, lies a single plastic brick. It is a vibrant, defiant shade of red, its 8 circular studs catching a faint sliver of light from a high window. For decades, this simple object was the universal symbol of childhood wonder, a building block for dreams that spanned generations. But in the early months of 2003, that red brick looked less like a toy and more like a relic of a vanished civilization. The world was moving on, and the empire built on colorful plastic was crumbling into the dirt. The headlines that year sent shockwaves through the global business community. It wasn't just a bad quarter. Lego, the world's most loved toy company, reported a staggering loss of $800 million. To the average observer, it was a number too large to comprehend, but to the workers in Billund, it was the sound of a death knell. A global icon, a brand that felt as permanent as the mountains, was on the absolute brink of filing for bankruptcy. The plastic empire was bleeding cash, and the wound seemed fatal. How did this happen? How did the world's most loved toy become its biggest financial disaster? It is a question that haunts every designer who ever walked the halls of the Lego headquarters. For decades, the company had been the gold standard of creative play. From the humble carpentry shop of Ole Kirk Christiansen to the global dominance of the 80s, the path had always seemed to lead upward. But suddenly, the click, that perfect, satisfying sound of 2 colorful bricks joining together, was being replaced by the silence of empty retail shelves and the frantic whispers of creditors circling the company like vultures. This wasn't just a business failing. It was the slow, agonizing death of a childhood legacy. For the Christiansen family, who had stewarded the brand through fires and wars, the weight of the moment was unbearable. They weren't just losing a company, they were losing the soul of their family's history. The motto, "Only the best is good enough," once a proud declaration of quality, now felt like a haunting reminder of how far they had fallen. The tension in the air was thick with a single terrifying question. Is a simple piece of plastic enough to survive in a digital world? By the turn of the millennium, the playground had changed. Children were no longer just looking at boxes of bricks. They were staring at glowing screens. Video games and the dawn of the internet promised infinite worlds without the mess of cleaning up small parts. To the executives in the 90s, the brick seemed old-fashioned, a dinosaur waiting for the asteroid. They feared that the physical world was losing its grip on the imagination, and in their panic, they began to run away from the very thing that made them special. Before we continue this journey through the rise and fall of the brick, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because the story of this recovery is one for the ages. The most shocking part of this collapse wasn't that Lego had run out of ideas. In fact, the truth was much more dangerous. The secret cause of the impending bankruptcy wasn't a lack of creativity, it was too much of it. The company was drowning in its own ambition. In a desperate bid to remain relevant, they had expanded into theme parks, clothing, jewelry, and video games, spreading their resources so thin that the core product began to suffer. They had forgotten that their power didn't come from being everything to everyone. It came from the simple logic of the brick. They had entered a death spiral of innovation, creating thousands of specialized parts that could only be used once, destroying the system of play that had made them a household name. The empire was falling because it had lost its focus, and by the end of 2003, it seemed there was no one left to pick up the pieces. The plastic empire was ending. To understand how the vibrant red brick ended up in the dust of a warehouse in 2003, we must travel back to 1932, to a modest carpentry shop in the small town of Billund, Denmark. This was the world of Ole Kirk Christiansen, a man whose hands were calloused by a lifetime of working with wood. In the grip of the Great Depression, Ola found himself in a desperate position. The demand for houses and ladders had vanished as families struggled to survive. But Ola noticed a strange phenomenon. Even in the hardest of times, parents would still scrape together their last few coins to buy a toy for their children. He pivoted his craft, turning his attention to small, beautifully carved wooden ducks. It was here that the name Lego was born, a contraction of the Danish words leg godt, which translates simply to play well. Ole didn't just build toys, he built a philosophy of uncompromising quality. He famously carved the motto, "Only the best is good enough," onto a wooden sign and hung it in his workshop. This was a rule of life. When his son, Godfred, once tried to save money by applying only 2 coats of varnish to a shipment of toys instead of the required 3, Ole forced him to retrieve the shipment from the train station and apply the final coat himself. Quality was the foundation upon which everything else would be built. However, the path to greatness was paved with literal fire. In 1942, during the height of the Second World War, a catastrophic fire tore through the Billund workshop. In a single night, Ole's life's work was reduced to a pile of smouldering ash. It was a moment that would have broken a lesser man, but Ole's resolve was as sturdy as the oak he carved. He rebuilt the factory, but he also kept his eyes on the horizon. In 1947, he made a decision that many viewed as a reckless gamble. He purchased a British plastic injection molding machine, a futuristic piece of technology that was virtually unknown in Denmark. By 1949, the workshop began producing automatic binding bricks. These were hollow plastic blocks that looked like the bricks we know today, but they lacked one critical element. They didn't stick together. Critics and retailers were unimpressed, calling them cheap plastic junk that could never replace the warmth and durability of wood. The true revolution occurred in 1958, a year that changed the history of play forever. Ole and Gottfried had become obsessed with the concept of clutch power. They knew that for the bricks to be more than just simple blocks, they needed to lock together with a satisfying, secure grip. On a cold January morning in 1958, they filed the patent for the stud and tube system. By adding small tubes to the underside of the bricks, they created a mechanical connection that was both strong and easy for a child to pull apart. This was the birth of the click. Sadly, Ole Kirk Christiansen passed away just months after the patent was granted, leaving Gottfried to lead the company into a new era. Gottfried refined the vision, establishing the Lego system of play. The idea was revolutionary in its simplicity. Every single brick made, regardless of its shape, must be compatible with every other brick ever manufactured. The 1970s and 1980s marked the golden era of global dominance. In 1978, the world was introduced to the Lego minifigure. With its iconic yellow face and movable limbs, the minifigure gave the plastic landscapes a sense of humanity and story. Suddenly, children weren't just building structures. They were role-playing as knights, astronauts, and city workers. The red logo became a universal symbol of creativity, transcending language and culture. By the mid-80s, Lego was a household name in every corner of the globe. The company was doubling its turnover every few years, and the Christiansen family became one of the wealthiest in Denmark. They were the undisputed kings of the toy world. But success has a way of blinding even the most disciplined minds. As the 90s approached, the third generation of leadership, headed by Kjeld Kirk Christiansen, inherited a company that felt invincible. Decades of uninterrupted growth had fostered a dangerous sense of strategic hubris. The management began to believe that the brand was so powerful it could succeed in any industry. They felt the simple brick was no longer enough. This overconfidence led them to believe they could branch out into clothing, watches, and massive theme parks without losing their way. They were drifting away from the system of play that had made them legends, convinced that Lego was no longer just a toy, but a lifestyle empire. They didn't realize that by trying to be everything, they were starting to lose the very soul of what they actually were. The strategic hubris that had taken root in the halls of Billund during the late 1990s was not a sudden explosion, but a slow-moving fog that obscured the company's vision. Management began to believe the classic plastic brick was an antique in a world moving toward high-speed digital entertainment. They felt the click was too slow for a generation raised on the rapid stimulation of video game consoles. In a frantic attempt to remain relevant, the board authorized a pivot that would nearly destroy them. They decided Lego should not just be a toy, but a lifestyle brand. This shift moved the company away from the engineering perfection of the stud and tube system and toward a dizzying array of products that had nothing to do with building. The foundation was cracking. Suddenly the iconic red logo appeared on children's clothing, watches, and jewelry. The company poured hundreds of millions into constructing massive Legoland theme parks in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Germany. While visually stunning, these parks were financial black holes, requiring massive operational overhead the company was ill-equipped to manage. They were no longer just master builders, they were now theme park operators and fashion designers. This overexpansion stretched resources to a breaking point, but the most damage occurred in the design rooms of Billund itself. In an effort to appeal to a supposed shorter attention span of modern children, Lego abandoned the system of play. Designers were encouraged to create large, specialized parts that allowed kids to build a toy in minutes. Themes like Galador introduced pieces that looked more like action figures than construction sets. These components lacked the universal compatibility that Gottfried Christiansen had fought to establish. If a piece could only be a specific limb, it lost its magic. You couldn't take a piece from a spaceship and turn it into a castle wall anymore. The infinite possibilities were replaced by a one-and-done philosophy that insulted the intelligence of their fans. This loss of identity led directly into the complexity trap. Because designers were no longer constrained by the existing library of parts, the number of unique Lego elements exploded from 6,000 to over 12,000. This was a logistical catastrophe. Each new piece required an expensive steel mold. The sheer variety of plastic shapes became impossible to track. While the variety on shelves looked impressive, the back-end costs were skyrocketing. The company was drowning in its own inventory, creating a nightmare of supply chain management that no one knew how to solve. Amidst this chaos, Lego suffered from profound strategic blindness. They were so focused on chasing the digital generation that they ignored their most loyal supporters, the adult fans of Lego, or AFOLs. The company viewed these dedicated hobbyists as a niche oddity rather than a vital resource. Meanwhile, the rise of Sony's PlayStation meant children had more options than ever. Lego tried to compete by launching its own internal video game studio, but without a clear focus, these projects became expensive failures that lacked the polish of established gaming giants. By 2003, the warning lights were screaming. Financial truth was finally laid bare in devastating internal audits. For the first time, Lego was losing money on almost every set it shipped. The cost of manufacturing specialized pieces, combined with the massive overhead of theme parks and clothing lines, meant even a successful sales season resulted in a net loss. The empire built on the principle that only the best is good enough was now producing products that were too expensive to make and too confusing to play with. The once mighty company was effectively paying its customers to take their bricks away. The plastic kingdom was on the verge of total collapse, and the Christiansen family realized their legacy was slipping away. The weight of 7 decades of history was pressing down on the shoulders of the third generation. They looked at the empty assembly lines and the overflowing warehouses and felt the cold breath of insolvency. Every day brought them closer to turning out the lights in Billund. The brick was broken, and the very heart of the company was failing under the pressure of its own ambition. The silent halls of the headquarters echoed with the sounds of a dying giant. Everything they built was vanishing. The financial reports landing on the desks in Billund during the dawn of 2003 were not merely disappointing. They were an epitaph written in cold, hard numbers. The cracks in the foundation had finally given way to a terrifying abyss. Sales had plummeted by a staggering 30% in a single year, a collapse that signaled a total and absolute rejection of the company's new direction. The lifestyle brand experiment, which was supposed to modernize the company, had backfired with such force that it left the accounts bleeding hundreds of millions of dollars in red ink. This was no longer a temporary dip in the market. It was a free fall into oblivion. The debt mountain grew taller with every passing week, casting a long, dark shadow over the Lego global headquarters. Creditors, who had once viewed the Danish icon with reverence, were now circling the halls like vultures waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. Their patience, once as solid as a perfectly joined stud and tube brick, had entirely vanished. The Christensen family found themselves in the humiliating position of begging for extensions from bankers who no longer believed in the magic of the brick. The financial world had decided that Lego was a relic of a bygone era, a 19th century concept struggling to breathe in a 21st century world. On the front lines of global commerce, the retail crisis was reaching a fever pitch. Major toy retailers, from the sprawling aisles of Walmart to the iconic floors of Toys R Us, were losing faith at an alarming rate. Store managers looked at the specialized, non-interlocking sets that cluttered their shelves and saw only stagnant inventory that refused to move. The fear among these retail giants was palpable. They worried that if they continued to stock Lego products, they would be left with useless plastic when the company inevitably declared bankruptcy. They began to aggressively clear their shelves, slashing prices to liquidate stock and making room for more predictable competitors who understood the modern digital landscape. A brand that had once commanded the most prestigious real estate in every toy aisle was now being unceremoniously pushed toward the discount bins. Deep within the design studios of Billund, the internal chaos was reaching a breaking point. Designers, who had been encouraged for years to exercise boundless creativity without any regard for manufacturing costs, were still churning out sets that defied the laws of industrial logic. Some of these new pieces were physically impossible to manufacture reliably at high speeds, leading to massive waste on the assembly lines. Others required custom steel molds that cost tens of thousands of dollars to produce, yet they were used for only a single part in one obscure, low-selling kit. The disconnect between the creative whims of the designers and the reality of the factory floor was absolute. Engineers screamed about the complexity trap, but their warnings were drowned out by a leadership still chasing the next big lifestyle trend. The emotional weight of this impending disaster fell most heavily on the third generation of the Christensen family. Kjeld Kirk Christiansen, the grandson of the founder, found himself wandering the silent halls of the company his family had built from nothing. He was haunted by the weight of 7 decades of history, realizing with a crushing sense of guilt that he might be the one to turn out the lights forever. This wasn't just about losing a corporation. It was about the death of a childhood legacy that had touched millions of lives. Every time he passed the original carpentry shop where his grandfather had once carved wooden ducks, he felt the sting of failure. The family's legendary motto, "Only the best is good enough," felt like a mockery of their current state. By late 2003, the company had entered a terminal death spiral. To cover the massive operational costs of their failing theme parks and fashion lines, they desperately needed to sell more toys. However, because their manufacturing process was so inefficient, They were actually losing money on almost every set they shipped. The more they sold, the faster they went broke. Internal projections showed they were only months away from total liquidation. Lego was technically insolvent, a hollow shell of an empire that was only still standing because the banks hadn't yet pulled the plug. The iconic, vibrant red logo now felt like a warning of a dying giant. The empire of the brick was on the verge of disappearing into the grey dust of history. The end felt like a certainty. In the shadow of total liquidation, a man who didn't look like a toy tycoon stepped into the chaos of Billund. Jürgen Vig Knudstorp was 35 years old, a former McKinsey consultant with a sharp mind for data and a gentle demeanor that belied a ruthless commitment to the truth. When he arrived in 2001, he was an outsider, but by 2004, he was the man holding the scalpel. The board and the Christiansen family were desperate, and Jürgen offered them something more terrifying than bankruptcy, a mirror. His first message to the leadership was a blunt, uncompromising strike to the heart of their pride. He told them, with clinical precision, that they were losing money not because the world had changed, but because they had forgotten who they were. The company had become a sprawling, bloated entity that cared more about being a lifestyle brand than the click of two plastic bricks coming together. The recovery began with what would later be known as the Great Pruning. It was a period of painful, necessary surgery. To save the patient, Jürgen realized they had to amputate the limbs that were draining the company's lifeblood. The 3 private jets were the first to go, a symbolic end to the era of corporate excess. But the most agonizing cut was selling the legendary Legoland theme parks. For decades, these parks were the physical manifestation of the Lego dream, yet they were hemorrhaging cash that the company simply did not have. By selling a majority stake, Jürgen signaled that no part of the empire was sacred if it didn't serve the core mission. The focus shifted from running roller coasters back to mastering the plastic brick. The surgery then moved inside the factory walls, targeting the complexity trap that had nearly strangled the manufacturing capacity. Jürgen saw an inventory of over 12,000 unique pieces as a logistical nightmare. He mandated cutting the number of unique elements by half. This wasn't just a cost-cutting measure, it was a creative revolution. By restricting the palette of available pieces, he forced the designers to rediscover the ingenuity that had defined the brand in its golden age. If a new set required a specialized piece, the designer had to justify its existence against the bottom line. If it didn't relate back to the system of play, the universal compatibility that allowed a brick from 1958 to fit a brick from 2004, it was killed. This return to the system of play was more than a business strategy. It was a restoration of the company's soul. Jürgen understood that the magic of Lego wasn't in a specialized plastic sword or a molded face. It was in the infinite possibilities of the basic block. He began to bridge the gap between the corporate offices and the people who actually loved the product. In a move that was revolutionary, Lego began to actively engage with the AFOLs, the adult fans of Lego. For years, the company had ignored these enthusiasts, but Jürgen saw them as the keepers of the flame. He listened to their feedback, understood their passion for the building experience, and realized that the magic was something the fans understood better than the executives. The transformation was exhausting and filled with friction. Long-time employees resisted the new, leaner reality. Yet, the numbers began to tell a story of hope. By stripping away the distractions of jewelry lines, video game studios, and clothing brands, the true strength of the brick began to emerge from the rubble. The surgeon's focus was working. Every decision was now filtered through a single, uncompromising lens. Does this make the building experience better? Does this honor the legacy of Ole Kirk Christiansen? The transformation of Lego wasn't about adding more features or chasing the latest digital fad. It was a masterclass in the power of subtraction. Jürgen Vig Knudstorp was stripping everything away until only the brick remained, proving that focus was the ultimate competitive advantage. The death spiral was slowing, and for the first time in years, the heart of Billund began to beat with a steady, purposeful rhythm. The empire was being rebuilt, one basic brick at a time, but the greatest challenges of the massive global resurrection were still to come in the difficult months lurking ahead. The stabilized foundation in Billund allowed Jürgen Vig Knudstorp to take calculated risks that had previously failed under the weight of inefficiency. The savior of the company was not just a return to basics, but a masterclass in high-stakes collaboration. Lego had experimented with licenses before, but under the new regime, partnerships with Star Wars and Harry Potter became more than just branding. They became an evolution of the system of play. Instead of the sets being isolated products, they were integrated into the core building experience with a level of detail that delighted fans of all ages. The distinct click of a lightsaber hilt fitting into a plastic hand became a sound heard in millions of living rooms, bridging the gap between cinematic wonder and tactile reality. This wasn't just selling toys. It was inviting fans to build their own universes, brick by brick. The massive revenue from these licenses provided the oxygen the company needed to breathe again. But this time, the money wasn't being wasted on private jets. It was being reinvested into the very soul of the plastic brick, ensuring that every new license enhanced the core mission of building. Behind the scenes, the chaos of the late 90s had been replaced by a clinical, almost obsessive focus on operational excellence. Jürgen Vig Knudstorp turned the supply chain into a weapon of precision, ensuring that the company's internal heart beat with the rhythm of a Swiss watch. Every single box that left the factory was scrutinized for its profit margin. They mastered the art of manufacturing, ensuring that the cost of every specialized mold was amortized across thousands of sets, finally dismantling the complexity trap that had nearly killed them. By standardizing the way pieces were designed, manufactured, and shipped, Lego achieved a level of efficiency that rivaled the world's top automotive manufacturers. The company wasn't just making toys anymore. They were mastering the science of global logistics. This discipline meant that when a child bought a set in Tokyo or New York, the profit generated was consistent and healthy. The click was no longer just a physical connection. It was the sound of a perfectly tuned financial machine performing at its peak. The results of this radical shift were nothing short of miraculous. The staggering $800 million loss of 2003 was soon a ghost of the past. Within a few short years, the red ink on the balance sheets turned into a flood of gold. Lego didn't just recover. It ascended to a level of wealth and influence that Ole Kirk Christiansen could never have dreamed of. By the end of the decade, Lego had become the most profitable toy company in history, outperforming and outlasting giants that had once tried to acquire it during its weakest moments. This financial explosion allowed the Christiansen family to secure their legacy for another century. The company was no longer a fragile Danish icon. It was a global financial juggernaut that seemed immune to the fluctuations of the market. But the ultimate proof of their resurrection wasn't found in a spreadsheet. It was found on the silver screen and in the collective imagination of the public. In 2014, the release of the Lego Movie transformed the brand into a worldwide cultural phenomenon. It wasn't merely a film. It was a 90-minute manifesto on the brand's philosophy. The movie artfully depicted the tension between following instructions, the cradle of rigid order, and the wild, unbridled creativity of the master builders. It reflected the balance between discipline and imagination. The film's success signaled that the brand had successfully bridged the gap between a simple plastic toy and a massive global entertainment empire. This cultural dominance was further solidified by how the company handled the perceived threat of the digital age. While other traditional toy makers lived in fear of tablets and gaming consoles, LEGO embraced them as new canvases for play. They built a digital bridge, creating video games and applications that complemented the physical brick rather than replacing it. They understood that a child's imagination doesn't see a wall between the physical and digital worlds. By maintaining the essence of building, they ensured that the plastic brick remained relevant in an era of pixels. This synergy turned LEGO into a modern titan. By the mid-2010s, the transformation was complete. Brand finance officially named LEGO the world's most powerful brand, surpassing even the biggest names in tech and fashion. They had traveled from the brink of total liquidation to the pinnacle of global recognition, evolving from a dying toy company into a global entertainment titan. The empire was restored, and the vibrant colors of the bricks once again symbolized a future of infinite possibility. However, as the world moved toward an era defined by sustainability and artificial intelligence, the brick's greatest test was still on the horizon, waiting in the final chapters of this extraordinary evolution. The survival of LEGO was not merely a financial triumph. It was a profound testament to the power of focus. In a world that often rewards expansion and diversification, Jürgen Vig Knudstorp proved that the ultimate competitive advantage lies in knowing exactly who you are, and more importantly, what you are not. By pruning the unnecessary branches of jewelry, theme parks, and clothing, he allowed the roots of the company to breathe again. This discipline transformed the internal culture of Billund from a state of chaotic hubris into a sanctuary of purposeful intent. The lesson for the business world was clear. Success is not found in doing everything, but in doing the right thing with unyielding precision. The strategy of the turnaround became a roadmap for any legacy brand facing the abyss, demonstrating that a return to the core is often the only path to a sustainable future. It was a victory of depth over breadth. Central to this resurrection was a return to the founding spirit of Ole Kirk Christiansen. His original motto, "Only the best is good enough," was no longer just a quaint phrase carved into wooden toys in a dusty workshop. It became the non-negotiable standard for every piece of plastic that left the factory. This commitment to quality is what allowed the brick to endure across generations, passed down from parents to children as a cherished heirloom of creativity. However, as the company looked toward the horizon of 2030, a new and daunting challenge emerged: sustainability. The very material that made the bricks indestructible, petroleum-based plastic, was now its greatest environmental liability. The quest for a green brick became the next moonshot for the engineers in Billund. They invested hundreds of millions into researching plant-based materials and recycled plastics that could replicate the exact clutch power and durability of the original. This mission was not just about corporate responsibility. It was about ensuring that the world children inherit is as bright and full of potential as the sets they build on their living room floors. They sought a legacy that would protect the planet. As the digital revolution accelerated, many wondered if a physical toy could truly survive a world increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence and the metaverse. In an age where digital experiences are becoming indistinguishable from reality, the tactile, physical click of two bricks joining together remains a grounding force. LEGO recognized that while screens offer infinite spectacle, they cannot replace the sensory satisfaction of physical creation. The company's strategy shifted to embrace these technologies not as competitors, but as tools to enhance the building experience. They began experimenting with augmented reality and AI-driven design assistance, ensuring the brick remained the central hub of a child's imaginative ecosystem. The goal was to prove that no matter how sophisticated the virtual world becomes, the human need to build something with our own hands is a fundamental part of who we are. The brick became a bridge between the physical and the infinite digital expanse. Today, If you were to walk into a quiet room and see a single red 2x4 brick resting on a table, it might look like a simple object. It is a piece of plastic that has remained virtually unchanged since the patent of 1958. Yet, that single brick represents a saga of fire, failure, and ultimate redemption. It is a symbol of the Christensen family legacy that refused to die, and a leader like Jürgen Vig Knudstorp, who had the courage to tell the truth when the walls were closing in. The world around the brick has shifted from the analog to the digital, from the industrial to the sustainable. But the brick itself remains a constant. It is a timeless invitation to dream, a universal language that transcends borders, ages, and languages. The story of Lego is not just about a toy company. It is a narrative of what happens when a giant remembers its soul and rediscovers its purpose. As long as there are children and adults who have never forgotten how to play, the empire built on a simple click will continue to rise. The plastic brick is more than a toy. It is a testament to human creativity, proving that when you focus on the core, you can build anything. From the ashes of 2003, they secured a place in the heart of humanity. Stay tuned for the next brand evolution.